If you were born between 1981 and 1996, you were handed a promise that turned out to be a trap. You were told that if you worked hard enough, if you were passionate enough, if you optimized yourself relentlessly enough, the world would reward you with stability, meaning, and the life your parents had by their 30s. You were told you were special. You were told you could be anything. You were told the formula: education, effort, ambition, and you followed it precisely, better than any generation before you. And then you arrived at adulthood and discovered that the formula had changed, the rules no longer applied, and the destination you had been promised was no longer available at any price you could afford to pay. You are millennials, born during the final years of optimism about the American promise, raised during its collapse, and now living in the aftermath of discovering that almost everything you were taught to believe about how life works was, at best, incomplete, and at worst, a lie. You are the most educated generation in history, and the first generation in modern America to be financially worse off than your parents. You are the most therapy literate, most self-aware, most emotionally articulate generation ever measured, and also among the most burned out, the most anxious, and the most trapped between the person you were told you could become and the person the world will actually allow you to be. This is not a video about avocado toast or participation trophies, or the shallow stereotypes that the culture uses to avoid looking at what actually happened to this generation. This is a psychological portrait of what it does to a person to spend their entire young adulthood chasing a moving target, to build an identity around achievement and then watch achievement fail to produce the promised outcome, and to carry all of it with a self-awareness sophisticated enough to name every wound, but not deep enough yet to heal it. You are deeper than you know. 1. The generation shaped by catastrophe. Every generation experiences historical events. What makes the millennial experience unusual is not that history happened to them, but that it happened during the precise window when identity, worldview, and orientation toward the future were still forming. And it kept happening, repeatedly, at intervals designed to prevent psychological recovery. The oldest millennials were in high school or college on September 11, 2001, and watched the foundational American narrative of safety and progress collapse in real time on screens they could not look away from. The event did not merely shock them, it rewired their developing sense of what the world was and whether it could be trusted. Research on collective trauma consistently shows that events experienced during late adolescence and early adulthood, when the prefrontal cortex is still integrating experience into stable worldview, leave deeper marks than the same events experienced either earlier or later in life. Then, before that first wound had scarred over, came the 2008 financial crisis. The oldest millennials were just entering the job market. The youngest were watching their parents lose jobs, lose homes, lose the specific security they had been told would be theirs if they simply did what they were supposed to do. Economists would later confirm what millennials felt in their bodies during those years. This was not a recession that would correct itself. It was the collapse of the promise. The generation that followed the formula most faithfully entered a world where the formula had stopped working, and the psychological damage of that timing is measurable and permanent. Studies on economic insecurity during early career formation show that the experience creates lasting patterns around money, risk, security, and trust that do not resolve even after financial circumstances improve. And then, before full recovery, before the rebuilding could complete, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. The oldest millennials were approaching 40. The youngest were in their mid-20s. It should have been the years of consolidation, of building on what the previous decade of struggle had finally begun to stabilize. Instead, the world stopped. Plans dissolved. Security evaporated again. The generation that had spent 15 years adapting to instability was handed more of it, and this time without even the promise that hard work would matter, because hard work could not stop a virus and could not repair an economy built on proximity and presence. What this produced is not merely a generation familiar with crisis. It is a generation whose psychological baseline was set during crisis and has never fully known what stability feels like long enough to trust it. 2. The identity built on output. Millennials did not invent workaholism, but they encountered it in a form so pervasive and so deeply entwined with identity that it became difficult to separate who they were from what they produced. The phrase hustle culture barely captures the psychological architecture that was built during the 2010s, a worldview in which rest was rebranded as laziness, boundaries were reframed as lack of commitment, and the refusal to monetize every skill and passion was treated as a moral failure rather than a reasonable choice. The psychological mechanism underneath hustle culture is not complicated. It is the promise that if you work hard enough, if you side hustle, if you optimize and network and personal brand yourself into visibility, you will finally achieve security in an economy that offers none. It is the individualization of a systemic problem, and it worked, not because it produced security, but because it produced enough success stories to make the formula seem plausible, and enough failure stories to make the failure feel personal. The cost of building an identity around productivity is that the self becomes conditional. You are valuable when you are producing. You are worthy when you are hustling. You are enough when the output is there. And the moment the output falters, so does the foundation of your sense of self. Burnout in this context is not merely exhaustion from overwork. It is the psychological crisis of realizing that you built your entire identity on something that cannot sustain it. And now the question, who am I when I am not producing, has no answer. The data on millennial burnout is as extensive as it is devastating. 66% report moderate to high levels of burnout. 84% report experiencing it in their current job. And most tellingly, millennials reach peak burnout at age 25, 17 years earlier than the average American, which tells you that this is not burnout from a long career of effort. This is burnout from attempting to build a self on a foundation that was never designed to hold one. And here is what makes the millennial relationship with hustle culture psychologically complex rather than simply tragic. Many of them are beginning to see it. The refusal that Gen Z has already made, the quiet quitting, the rejection of career as identity, millennials are arriving at more slowly, more painfully, because they spent the first decade of their adulthood pouring everything into the system before realizing it was not going to give back what it promised. The turning away from hustle is not a trend. It is a generation recognizing that they were sold a trap and deciding, finally, to stop buying it. 3. Self-improvement as a second job. If hustle culture colonized millennials' relationship with work, optimization culture colonized their relationship with themselves. The generation that came of age alongside the internet did not merely encounter self-improvement advice, they encountered it algorithmically, endlessly, in every scroll and every feed, until self-improvement stopped being an occasional activity and became a chronic background state, a second job that never clocked out. The millennial morning routine became a performance of optimization. Meditation apps, gratitude journals, cold showers, supplements, productivity planners, habit trackers. Not one or two of these things, which might constitute self-care, but all of them simultaneously, as if the self were a system that could be debugged and upgraded into something finally acceptable. The drive underneath this is not mysterious. It is the same drive that produces hustle culture, the belief that if you can just get yourself right, optimized, disciplined, healed, the external circumstances that are actually the problem will somehow stop mattering. But the self is not a system, it is a person, and treating a person like a project that needs constant improvement produces a very specific psychological outcome. It makes rest feel like failure, and makes the present self feel like a rough draft that will be acceptable only once the optimization is complete. The optimization never completes. There is always another book, another framework, another thing to fix, another layer to heal. And the question that optimization culture will not let you ask, what if I am already enough, becomes almost impossible to access, because enough is not a state you arrive at through improvement. It is a state you claim despite the lack of it. Research on perfectionism, which millennials score higher on than any previous generation, shows that it correlates not with higher achievement, but with higher anxiety, depression, and chronic dissatisfaction. The millennial who has read every self-help book, who has tried every productivity system, who meditates and journals and tracks and optimizes, often arrives at the end of all that effort more exhausted than when they began. Not because the tools are useless, but because they were using tools to solve a problem that is not actually solvable through individual optimization. The fact that the world is structurally harder for them than it was for the generation before, and no amount of personal improvement will change that. 4. The crisis that became the baseline. The quarter-life crisis, the period of uncertainty, reevaluation, and existential questioning that traditionally occurred in the mid-20s and resolved by 30, is supposed to be temporary. For millennials, it never ended. It simply became the texture of their entire adulthood. The quarter-life crisis for previous generations was about choosing a path. For millennials, it has been about discovering that there is no stable path to choose. The crisis is not who do I want to be, but who can I afford to be in an economy that does not reward the things I was told to value. It is not what do I want to do with my life, but how do I survive while also preserving some version of the person I thought I was becoming. And because the conditions that produce the crisis, economic precarity, delayed milestones, a world in constant flux, have not resolved, the crisis has not resolved either. What this produces psychologically is a generation that is perpetually in a state of becoming without ever arriving. The millennial in their mid-30s often carries the same questions, the same uncertainty, the same sense of not quite having it together that they carried at 25. Not because they failed to mature, but because the markers of maturity, stable career, home ownership, family formation, financial security, have been systematically delayed or made inaccessible. The psychological expectation of what your 30s should feel like no longer matches the lived reality of what they actually feel like, and the gap between expectation and reality is where the crisis lives. And the crisis is compounded by the fact that millennials are extraordinarily aware of it. They can name it, articulate it, analyze it with sophisticated psychological language, and that awareness, rather than resolving the crisis, often deepens it. Because once you understand that your quarter-life crisis is not a personal failure, but a structural condition affecting your entire generation, the question becomes not how do I fix myself, but how do I live in a world that will not give me the stability I need to move forward? And that is a much harder question to answer. 5. The milestones that keep receding. There are specific markers that previous generations used to define the transition into full adulthood: financial independence, marriage, home ownership, having children. For millennials, every single one of those markers has been delayed by an average of 5 to 10 years compared to their parents' generation, and for many, delayed indefinitely. The median age of first marriage for millennials is now 30 for men and 28 for women, compared to 23 and 21 for their parents' generation. Home ownership rates for millennials lag significantly behind previous generations at the same age, with many unable to afford the down payment required in markets where housing costs have outpaced wage growth by multiples. The decision to have children, once assumed as a natural next step, has become for many millennials a financial calculation rather than a life choice, delayed or abandoned entirely because the economic conditions required to support a family feel permanently out of reach. What is psychologically important about these delays is not that they are happening, but what they represent. The milestones are not merely life events, they are psychological thresholds, rites of passage that signal to the self and to society that you have crossed into adulthood. When those thresholds are inaccessible, the psychological experience is not merely delay, but a kind of permanent liminity, a sense of being stuck in an extended adolescence not by choice, but by circumstance. And the delay is complicated by the fact that millennials are simultaneously expected to perform the responsibilities of adulthood without access to its stabilizing structures. They are often financially supporting aging parents while also unable to afford their own homes. They are expected to be emotionally mature, professionally competent, and socially responsible while living in conditions that previous generations would have described as transitional. Roommates in their 30s, rental housing with no equity, retirement savings that barely exist because the present is too expensive to allow planning for the future. The result is a generation that feels simultaneously too old and too young. Too old to still be figuring things out, too young to have given up on the milestones they were promised. And the psychological weight of that contradiction is one of the defining features of the millennial inner life.
6. The self-reliance that isolates.
Millennials were raised on a paradox. They were told they could rely on the system if they worked hard, and then the system collapsed, and they learned, sometimes suddenly, sometimes gradually, that the only person they could truly rely on was themselves. That lesson, learned young and learned hard, produced a generation that is hyper-independent, not as a personality trait, but as a survival adaptation. Hyper-independence looks like strength from the outside. It is the person who handles everything alone, who does not ask for help, who has learned to be entirely self-sufficient because past experience taught them that relying on others, on systems, on promises, on institutions, is a vulnerability they can no longer afford. But hyper-independence is not the same as resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover from difficulty with support. Hyper-independence is the capacity to survive difficulty by refusing to need support in the first place. And the cost of that refusal is a specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of being unable to let people in. Millennials often have friends, have relationships, have social lives that look full from the outside, but the quality of those connections is frequently shallow, in the specific way that comes from never letting anyone see the parts of you that need something, never asking for the kind of help that would require you to be vulnerable, never trusting that if you stopped performing competence for long enough to admit you are struggling, the person on the other side would stay. Research on loneliness consistently shows that it is not about the quantity of social connection, but the quality of being known. And hyper-independence systematically prevents the kind of being known that relieves loneliness, because being known requires letting someone see you when you are not handling everything. And millennials have spent the better part of 2 decades learning that not handling everything is dangerous. The loneliness is compounded by the fact that many millennials can see it happening. They understand that they are isolating themselves, that their self-reliance has become a wall rather than a strength, that they are lonely in rooms full of people who care about them but cannot reach them. And the awareness of the pattern does not make the pattern easier to break, because the belief underneath it that you are safest when you need nothing from anyone was not formed by a single experience, but by a decade of watching the things you are supposed to be able to rely on fail. What the culture gets wrong about millennials is almost everything. The stereotypes are surface level, dismissive, and designed to avoid looking at the actual conditions that shaped this generation. But what millennials often get wrong about themselves is this: that the struggle is a personal failure rather than a structural reality, that the exhaustion is a character flaw rather than a reasonable response to impossible circumstances, that the fact that self-awareness has not yet produced healing means the self-awareness was insufficient. You were not insufficient. The world you were handed was. You followed every rule, and the rules changed. You optimized yourself relentlessly, and the optimization did not produce the promised outcome. You hustled, and the hustle burned you out rather than built you up. You became the most therapy literate, most emotionally articulate, most self-aware generation in history, and none of that awareness was enough to change the fact that you were navigating a world that was structurally harder for you than it had been for the generation before. But here is what is also true. The self-awareness you carry, the emotional intelligence you have built, the refusal to accept suffering silently the way previous generations did, that is not nothing. That is the beginning of something genuinely different. You are the generation that named burnout, that made therapy mainstream, that refused to accept that career should be identity and productivity should be worth. You are the bridge between the generation that accepted the system without question and the generation that is refusing it outright. And that position, between acceptance and refusal, between what was promised and what is possible, is psychologically difficult, but it is also where change begins. If you are a millennial, the world has spent a lot of time telling you that your struggles are your fault, that you should have been more resilient, more adaptable, more willing to accept less than what you were promised. Most of that narrative is designed to keep you focused on fixing yourself rather than questioning the system. But you are not the problem. You are the generation that inherited a broken promise and has spent your entire adulthood trying to make it work anyway. And the fact that you are exhausted is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that you have been carrying more than anyone should have had to carry alone. You are deeper than you know.